Hello, my name is Michaela Wade, and this is my book club presentation. So, this is the book that I chose, Gang Leader for a Day. So, the vulnerable population is going to be the residents of the Robert Taylor government housing, specifically the low income Black families, the women, and the children. And I have a couple quotes on there that gives you some detail about it. For the children, the author refers many times throughout the book. He saw children in the classroom and they were showing off their guns, or they were smoking marijuana cigarettes, or they were leaving to go to parties. They weren't really getting a proper education. There's also another part where he talks about being at a back to school party and shots rang out and everybody was screaming and running. So, definitely not a safe place for children to be. Um, and then the women, they were known to get caught up with the gang and they couldn't particularly have jobs, so they would sell things out of their apartments like food or babysit or do other things like that. They didn't really have an option to create a career. Health disparities. So they had limited access to health care. Quite a few times throughout the book, he talks about how his first reaction is to, we'll call the ambulance. That's the that's the number one thing you should do. And then here in this quote, the hospital was only 2 miles away and 15 minutes had passed and no one was there. It was known that police and the ambulances did not come to this community because it was considered too high risk and dangerous. So you had to rely on other people to drive them or just the knowledge of the people living in the community to help them. And then also the violence and trauma. There was so many instances in this book where people were getting shot at or beat, or there was just a lot of violence. And so there's definitely a lot of injuries related to that. Poor housing conditions. So in this quote, last summer we didn't have running water for a month. So 1 week without a door was nothing. I mean, these living conditions were terrible. I have a couple pictures later on about what some of the conditions looked like. And then just stressful. There was always gang activity. You never knew what was going to happen. There was loud noises. There was yelling. Just not an environment to be healthy in. So this one, health promotion. So in-house or community clinics, since we already talked about that healthcare and resources would not come to them, being able to make the resources there in the community, like especially in the house, like the women, training some of them to be able to help in some of these situations could have helped, and providing leaders and resources could really make a difference. Food and nutrition. Some cooking classes and ideas on how to use WIC provided food because sometimes that isn't the best food. So, being able to use that food to provide for your family would be great. And then also women's health. I talked about earlier how the women were normally beat or they had to also be prostitutes, and there was just not a lot of opportunities. They were thrown into some bad situations most of the time. So I think really some safe sex resources and some safe houses for the women would have been very beneficial. What could new nurses learn from this book? So I have non-judgmental care. You never know who your patients are going to be, what they're going to look like, where they're going to come from. I mean, sometimes you have prisoners, sometimes you never know. I work in home health, so I never know what house I'm going to walk into, what it's going to look like, what it's going to be, but those patients need to be treated the same as patients that live in a mansion or have $1 million. Teamwork. I liked this quote. This was from one of the older ladies in the book. She said, "We live in a community, not the projects." That they came together as a community, and a lot of things can happen whenever you have teamwork and you're working together for a common goal. Environmental effects on personal health. So for that one, I mean, the environment that you're around affects your both physical and mental health. So especially the environment, a bunch of the environments in this book was that the hallways smelled like pee, there was trash, it wasn't clean, there was stress, there was fighting. So that's not good for mental or physical, and that really makes a difference where you're at, where your living situation is, makes a huge impact on your overall health. What could veteran nurses learn from this book? It reinforces cultural competency, so we all have to do cultural competency and probably have to do it every so often. But this just lets you know of the fact that it really does make an effect on how you care for people. You can sometimes be stuck in your ways or your views, and this is a great way to kind of a reminder that other things can be happening. Awareness. And then another thing, this is you get used to, okay, you assess, you give the medicine, you do this, you do that, you do the doctor's orders, and maybe not look into some core problems or ask deeper questions about what's going on at home. And that could also just something you can get stuck in your ways and kind of need some reminder to look at it differently. And then ethics. This book really shows the inner workings of a very damaged community that needed help at this time. Brings up a lot of questions of, is this right or wrong? Is this okay? Just some questions to think about as you continue nursing. Surprising topic. So one of the big things that I noticed was the police. So there was quite a few instances where I know I said earlier the police just didn't come out there. Well, towards the end of the book, they started to come out sometimes, but they were often, there's a whole chapter called The Black and the Blue, and it's about a lot of police brutality and just not being treated well by people you're supposed to trust and protect you. Um, let's see. Yeah, the cops didn't come to the area to patrol. He said it was almost like like a board game, and that the police would come there to like mess with them, or they would steal their jewelry and cash, and just not someone trustworthy. And then also reliance on the gang. A lot of the women that were prostitutes or the younger kids who were just starting in the gang and getting paid just a little bit, and people who needed protection, they really relied a lot on the gang. I mean, protection, work, money, everything you need, they kind of offered it. So the gang wasn't necessarily a horrible thing to these residents. They needed their help sometimes. Golden nuggets. So this is another thing talking about the gang. So the gang was reliable. They provided jobs, protection, resources. There wasn't a lot of people offering to help or coming to protect or patrol. So they were the only ones that were even somewhat doing that. And then Miss Bailey, this was that lady that I talked about earlier. So she held a lot of power and respect over other people. She had an authoritative role for no reason other than she built it herself. So she took on a lot of different roles and was able to help a lot of different families, and she just seemed like a really, really great woman. Let's see, mood. So on this one, I put frustrated. These people were supposed to be protected by the law enforcement, the community, and the healthcare systems, and they were just completely neglected. They were not given the treatment that they needed. They almost lived in their own city, and no one else went to that city to help them. They had to figure out how to do it themselves. And then respect. Miss Bailey and JT. JT is the one of the big leaders of the gang. Maybe they didn't do things great or the right way, but they did try their best. They did try to help people, and JT would give people jobs and protect people, and then Miss Bailey had a lot of resources, and she would give out coats and food during the winter. And she used to have meetings where people that lived kind of on her block would come to the meeting, bring a problem, and she would see if she could try and fix it. Questions I had were, how would the author compare the ghettos of Chicago to New York? Because the very last chapter of the book is the gang leader giving the author a paper that has the information of one of the big gang leaders in New York. And he was like, go continue to learn and explore. So I wonder how that compared. And then how did demolishing the Robert Taylor housing affect the crime and violence rates in the community? Like, did they drastically drop or did it kind of linger? What did JT and the gang, or why did they welcome the author into the inner workings? Because they could have very well killed him as soon as he walked in there. They could have seen him as a threat and kicked him out. But they decided to welcome him in, and he was a part of their life for a couple years, and he got to learn a lot of stuff. He was actually able to be the gang leader for the day. That's where the name comes from. Is JT was like, here, you really want to know how it works? You lead everybody for a day. And then here's my references.